Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 15, Lesson 1, and we're going to be talking about John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who wins the election of 1960, and there are going to be a number of firsts with him winning the election of 1960. For example, it's the first time that a candidate makes successful and substantial use of television to campaign and win an election, as a for instance. But there are other things as well that President Kennedy does that his presidency will do to help change American society. So, in addition to just having a president that is just in general overall TV savvy, we're going to also expect a president to keep his or her faith out of politics, which prior to this was something that often presidents would bring into their politics. But ever since Kennedy's election, the private faith life of our president hasn't been as important as it was before Kennedy's election. So let's just take a step back and take a look at this race between Kennedy and his opponent. The Republican candidate for this election was Richard Nixon, and the Democrat, of course, was Kennedy. And what's interesting here is that when it comes to foreign policy, Kennedy and Nixon had very similar approaches. They both, for example, really took this perspective that communism was kind of anti-moral, it was anti-ethical, that it was against what it meant to be an American, whether it was going against God or enslaving men by removing their free will, destroying justice. And Nixon as a Republican and Kennedy as a Democrat, they shared this perspective that communism was ethically evil. But they also, and here's where it's interesting, Nixon, who was actually Eisenhower's vice president, and Kennedy himself did not like massive retaliation. They preferred Truman's limited wars because of the risk that comes with using massive retaliation, namely nuclear war. Now, there were definitely some key differences between the two candidates, so please don't think that there weren't key differences between the two candidates. So, for example, Nixon had some different opinions with Kennedy on things like deficit spending. They had fears about inflation. Nixon was a very formal candidate. He was a very traditional candidate, the kind of guy who would have been right at home running for president in the 1920s, 1930s. Kennedy was younger. He was a World War II veteran. And he was unique in the sense that Kennedy was Catholic, and he had to deal with this again and again and again as part of his makeup during the campaign. So, for example, here's one quote from Kennedy that points out how often and how frequently he would have to defend this issue of his personal faith. He says, "I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic." Remember, we had never had a Catholic president before. And the fear here came from those people who were Protestant and said, well, the Pope tells Catholics what to do. The Pope is in charge of the Catholic faith and all Catholic people. What happens if the Pope tells John Fitzgerald Kennedy to go to war with the Soviets? Will he do it? That kind of fear, kind of irrational thinking about the Pope controlling Kennedy really kind of got certain people upset, especially in the South and the Deep South. So to kind of ease those concerns, Kennedy talks a lot about that separation of church and state, that I'm a Democratic candidate for president. There's a dividing line, a wall between church and state. Nixon didn't have that fear. Nixon didn't have that worry. But what Nixon and Kennedy both talked about, Kennedy more than Nixon in particular, was something he called the missile gap. And here's an example. It's supposed to be a gap that existed between the amount of nuclear missiles we had as a nation and the Soviets had as a nation. Now, if you look at this actual statistical chart, you can see that in the 1960s, when Kennedy is running, we had way freaking more missiles than the Soviet Union, but we didn't know that. Our intelligence was bad. Kennedy and others actually had thought that the Soviet Union had more nuclear missiles than we did. So there was a real fear over the Soviets being able to strike us first and defeat us so badly we wouldn't be able to win in a nuclear war. Kennedy wants to address that by saying we need to build more nuclear missiles and make sure we have them available in case a limited war doesn't work. The last thing I want to point out, we're going to do some work with this in class, is just how TV savvy Kennedy really was and how TV savvy, Nixon wasn't. This was one of the first televised debates that we're going to see between presidential candidates. And in that debate, Kennedy prepares in such a way and appears on TV in such a way that he looks relaxed and comfortable. He looks natural. He connects to the voters. He actually talks to us as viewers watching the television. Nixon looks uncomfortable. He looks awkward, can't sit properly. The suit that he chose doesn't look good on TV, as a for instance. When he's debating, Nixon doesn't look at us as a people. He instead looks at Kennedy. He addresses Kennedy like he's debating Kennedy. Kennedy looks into the TV screen at us. These are examples, and there are many others we'll talk about tomorrow, about how Kennedy was TV savvy and Nixon wasn't. The bottom line is, you take all of these things together, even though they're similar on foreign policy, Kennedy's approach to the missile gap, Kennedy's approach to the issue of his faith, is going to help him convince people to elect him into office, and he's going to win.